The night air felt thick, as though something unseen was weighing it down. I gripped the cold metal of the car door, trying to steady myself. She was trembling, her voice cracking. The street was eerily quiet. "We need to leave now," she said, her eyes flicking nervously between me and the dimly lit house behind us. I stared at her, my heart racing, trying to process the seriousness of her words. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The urgency in her tone cut through the stillness, leaving no room for doubt. Something was terribly wrong. "Why? What's happening?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I really wanted to hear the answer. She didn't reply. Instead, she yanked open the driver's side door, her hands shaking so violently it took her 2 attempts to get the key in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, she glanced at me again. Her eyes held a look I had never seen before, fear, but not the kind that comes from a quick scare. This was deeper, more raw. It made my stomach twist. "Get in the car," she ordered, her voice now more firm. I hesitated for just a moment, long enough to catch a glimpse of her reflection in the side mirror. She wasn't the same woman I knew. The calm, composed person I had spent years with was gone, replaced by someone who seemed desperate, someone fleeing from something. I opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, unsure if I was making the right choice, but feeling like I didn't have any other option. The car jerked forward, speeding down the empty street. I couldn't help but glance back at the house. Everything looked normal. No flashing lights, no signs of trouble. But the knot in my stomach only grew tighter. "What are we running from?" I asked in a whisper, the words barely escaping. The tension in the car was suffocating. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles turning white. She was breathing in shallow, quick bursts, as though trying to keep it together. "I can't explain everything right now," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You just have to trust me. We're not safe." I wanted to demand answers, but the weight of her words stopped me. This wasn't the time for questions. Not yet. I stared out the window, the city lights blurring past, trying to piece things together. But it was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Nothing made sense. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound being the hum of the tires on the road. My mind was racing with 100 different thoughts, all of them conflicting. Why were we leaving? Who or what were we running from? I glanced at her again, trying to read her expression, but she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Without warning, she swerved the car to the side of the road. The sudden stop jolted me forward in my seat, and I looked at her in confusion. "Why are we stopping?" I asked. Her hand shook as she reached for the gearshift. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. She didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, her jaw tight. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, like speaking the words out loud would make them too real. A chill ran down my spine, the kind you get when you sense something bad is coming. What's happening?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended, more unsure. She turned to face me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She was fighting to hold it together, but it was clear she was struggling. "I've been hiding something from you," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. For a moment I thought she might break down entirely, but she didn't. She swallowed hard, straightened her shoulders, like she was preparing for what came next. I sat frozen, my muscles tense, waiting for her to continue. She opened her mouth to speak, but then something shifted in her. Her expression softened, and before I could react, she leaned toward me. Her lips brushed mine, soft, uncertain, but filled with an urgency that shocked me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a second, I was paralyzed. Everything, the confusion, the fear, melted away in that single moment. It wasn't the kiss itself that took me by surprise. It was what it meant. Everything about it felt like a turning point. She pulled back almost instantly, her breath ragged and uneven. The silence that followed was deafening. We both sat there motionless, neither of us able or willing to speak. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came. I was overwhelmed with a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. The air between us felt thick with tension, as if we were standing on the edge of something dangerous. "I'm sorry," she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Just then, the sound of her phone buzzing broke the silence. She jumped, fumbling to grab it from her bag. I watched her glance at the screen, her face draining of color. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaky. Now, before I could ask what was going on, she slammed the car into gear, and we were speeding down the road again. My mind was spinning, struggling to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing seemed to add up. The car rumbled down the narrow road, and soon the city lights were behind us. All that remained were the faint beams of the headlights cutting through the trees. I stared out the window, trying to process everything. The kiss, her words, the fear that still hung in the air between us. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over us. My voice felt distant, not quite my own. "To the lake house," she answered, not looking at me. Her tone was clipped, still thick with tension. "We'll be safe there." I didn't understand. Safe from what? From who? I wanted to press her for answers, but something told me she wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. I turned back to the window, watching as the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. The road ahead was dark, winding, and unfamiliar. After what felt like an eternity, the car slowed as we approached a small wooden gate. It creaked as she opened it, and we drove down a dirt path flanked by overgrown bushes. The lake house appeared in the distance, its outline faint against the dimming sky. It was smaller than I imagined. More of a cozy cabin, tucked far away in the woods, isolated from everything. She cut the engine, and we sat in silence, the quiet stretching between us. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant croak of frogs near the water. I turned to look at her, but her eyes were fixed on the house in front of us. Her jaw was clenched, as though she was preparing herself for something. "You've been here before, haven't you?" I asked, more like I was stating a fact than asking a question. The way she stared at the house made it obvious this place wasn't unfamiliar to her. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It used to belong to my parents. They brought me here when I was younger." She stopped there, leaving it at that. Without saying another word, she opened her door and stepped out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I followed her inside, the dry leaves crunching beneath my feet, and the cool air of the night wrapping around me. Inside, the house had that old musty smell, wood and dust mixed together, the air thick from being shut up for so long. The furniture was old and worn, the signs of years of use visible, yet everything was arranged as if someone had just been living here. I ran my fingers over the back of the couch, gathering a thin layer of dust. She disappeared into one of the back rooms, leaving me to explore on my own. The place felt frozen in time, like the moment we walked in, everything had stopped moving. It was as though we were the only people left. My eyes were drawn to a large window that overlooked the lake, the moonlight barely revealing its surface. The water was motionless, as still as glass. It reflected the dark outline of the trees on the opposite shore, their shadows stretching out in long, jagged lines. I wasn't sure what we were hiding from, but being here, away from everything, left me with a strange, unsettling feeling of isolation, like we were trapped. Then I heard her footsteps approaching, and when I turned, she was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She had changed out of the clothes she wore in the car and into an old sweater, the kind that looked like it belonged to someone else. "You should get some rest," she said softly, almost apologetically. "It's been a long night." I wanted to ask her what was really going on, to demand answers about what we were running from, but the exhaustion hit me all at once. I felt drained, my body heavy, my thoughts sluggish, like the adrenaline of the night was finally wearing off. I nodded and followed her down the hall to a small room at the end. The room was simple, just a bed and a dresser, but it was enough to make me feel safe for now. She hesitated at the door, as if she was about to say something else, but the words never came. Instead, she gave me a small, tight smile and walked back down the hall, leaving me alone in the quiet again. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind still racing, trying to process everything that had happened. I thought about the kiss, the way her lips felt against mine. It hadn't just been a kiss. It was something deeper, something more urgent, like she was reaching for something that was just out of her grasp. I turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around me, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept returning to her. The fear in her eyes, the unanswered questions that were stacking up in my mind. What were we running from? And why did it feel like we were on the verge of something much bigger, something darker? Then I heard the footsteps again. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but they were real, soft, purposeful steps moving down the hallway. I sat up, listening closely. She had told me we'd be safe here, but now, the longer I listened, the more uncertain I became. I quietly slipped out of bed and crept toward the door, peeking out into the hallway. The lights were off, but the faint glow from the moon filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer, and my heart began to race. I moved down the hallway, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the living room, I saw her standing by the window, staring out at the lake, her face pale in the dim light. She didn't turn when I approached, didn't even acknowledge I was there. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She was silent for a long moment before answering, her eyes still fixed on the water. "We're not safe here." Not really. The tension between us felt so thick, it was as though it might snap at any second. The days that followed felt endless. A strange kind of rhythm settled between us, one built on avoidance. She spent her time walking around the house, checking windows and doors over and over as if she was expecting something. I spent mine pretending everything was fine, though deep down I knew it wasn't. The house itself seemed to reflect our growing anxiety. It was too quiet, and the silence felt oppressive, like a heavy blanket wrapping around us. I found myself constantly listening, waiting for something, anything, that might explain why we were hiding here. But all I ever heard was the creaking of old floorboards and the whispering wind outside. One afternoon, I wandered into the kitchen, hoping for some kind of distraction. She was already there, standing by the counter, staring out the small window that looked out onto the backyard. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee, though she hadn't taken a sip. The space between us felt thick with everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had been building for days. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked worn out, but not just tired, exhausted, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. Her eyes, usually sharp and full of determination, were now dull, unfocused. It was clear she hadn't been sleeping, and neither had I. I finally broke the silence. "I don't understand why we're still here," I said, the question lingering in the air. She didn't look at me, but I could see her grip tighten around the cup in her hands. "We're here because we have to be," she replied, her voice quiet but tense. "That's not an answer," I snapped, stepping into the room. "You keep saying we're not safe, but you won't tell me why. What's really going on?" This time, she turned to face me. Her eyes searched mine, as if trying to find something, maybe an understanding that had been missing since we arrived. I saw a flicker of doubt pass across her face, but it was gone almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of control she always wore. "You need to trust me," she said, her tone firm. "I'm doing this to protect you." I shook my head, frustration rising in my chest. "Protect me from what?" I demanded. "You keep saying we're in danger, but I don't see it. There's no one here. We're hiding away in this house, cut off from everything, and I'm starting to think you're not telling me the whole story." She sighed, setting the cup down on the counter. Her shoulders slumped, and for a brief moment, I thought she might finally come clean, but instead, she just stared at me, her face weary. "You don't need to know everything," she said softly. "Some things are better left unsaid." That was it, the final straw. I couldn't take it anymore. The evasions, the secrets, the way she kept shutting me out. I stepped closer, my voice rising. "I'm not a child anymore. I have a right to know what's going on. If we're in danger, if something's coming, I deserve to understand what we're up against. Her eyes flashed. Anger, maybe, or fear, but she didn't back down. You think you're ready for the truth? She asked, her voice low. You're not. Try me, I shot back. We stood there for a moment, locked in a silent standoff, neither of us willing to move. Then, without warning, she brushed past me and headed for the front door. I followed her outside, the screen door slamming shut behind us. The air was thick with humidity, the sky a dull gray, and the lake, which was usually calm, looked darker now. Its surface was choppy, disturbed by the wind. She walked down the small path to the dock, her steps quick and purposeful. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried to keep up. When she reached the end of the dock, she stopped, staring out at the water. I stood beside her, waiting for her to speak, but she was silent. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment, I wondered if she might just walk into the lake, disappearing into the darkness, leaving all of this behind. I'm not who you think I am, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the sound of the water lapping against the wood. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I couldn't fully grasp. What do you mean? I asked, my confusion written all over my face. She turned to look at me, her expression raw, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. There are things about my past I haven't told you, she said, her voice trembling. Things that could hurt you if you knew. I stared at her, my mind racing. This was it. The truth, or at least part of it. Then tell me, I urged. I don't care what it is. I just want to understand. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. It's not that simple. If I tell you, everything will change. You won't look at me the same way. You'll hate me. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm, trying to steady her. I won't hate you, I promised, my voice soft but firm. She let out a bitter laugh, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. You don't know that. You can't know that. I didn't know what to say. The weight of her words left me speechless. What did she need from me? I made mistakes, she continued, her voice shaky. I did things I'm not proud of. And now they're catching up to me. To us. The heaviness of her confession settled over me like a thick fog. I had always known there were parts of her life she kept hidden. Parts she wouldn't talk about, but I never imagined it was anything like this. What kind of mistakes? I asked cautiously, though I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear the answer. She hesitated, biting her lip, weighing whether or not to share more. After a long pause, she took a deep breath. I got involved with the wrong people. People who don't forgive. And now they're looking for me. Her words hit me like ice water, sending a chill down my spine. I had known it, this wasn't just some vague threat. We were being hunted. There was a real danger, one that could catch up to us at any moment. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I demanded, frustration bubbling over. Because I didn't want you to worry. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep you safe, she said, her eyes filled with regret. But I was wrong. I didn't know what to say. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of everything. The secrets, the danger, the fact that we were being hunted by people I didn't even know existed. She turned away from me, heading back toward the house, leaving me standing on the dock, staring out at the dark water. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and fear. I had wanted the truth, but now that I had it, I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. The days that followed were a blur, as if the world had slowed down while the tension inside the house grew thicker. The lake house, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a prison. The walls were closing in around us, the woods outside pressing in with each passing hour. I had foolishly hoped that once she told me the truth, things would become clearer, but instead, everything became more complicated. She had changed, distant, colder, like telling me the truth had put an emotional wall between us. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach her. She spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought, watching the lake as if it held the answers we both needed. Sometimes, she'd mutter something cryptic like they're coming or it's only a matter of time. But whenever I pushed her for more details, she would just shake her head, refusing to elaborate. I tried to distract myself, but the silence in the house was suffocating. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made my heart race. I knew we couldn't stay here forever. We were just waiting, but for what? I wasn't sure. The waiting was slowly driving me mad. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I found her in the kitchen, her back to me as she washed dishes in the small sink. The sound of running water filled the room, but it did little to drown out the tension between us. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. Her hands continued their steady, methodical motion, scrubbing the plate as if it were an automatic task. The rhythmic, robotic movements only made my frustration grow. "I'm serious," I pressed, stepping closer. "We need a plan. We can't just sit here waiting for them to find us." Still, she said nothing. The only sound was the clink of the plate as it was placed on the drying rack. I could feel my patience starting to crack. Why was she acting like this? After everything, after the truth she'd finally shared, why was she still shutting me out? "Talk to me," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "You owe me that much." Finally, she turned to face me, her eyes meeting mine. But it wasn't anger or fear I saw there. It was resignation. "There's nothing more to say," she said quietly. "I told you what you needed to know. Now we just wait." "Wait for what?" I asked, throwing my hands up in frustration. "For them to come and find us? For something terrible to happen? This isn't a plan. It's suicide." Her eyes narrowed slightly. I saw a flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared, masked by that impenetrable calm. She turned her gaze back to the window, where the last light of day was slipping behind the trees. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No matter where we go, they'll find us. It's better if we stay here." I stared at her in disbelief. "So we just sit here and wait for them to show up? That's your plan?" She didn't respond, and the silence between us grew heavy, suffocating. I felt like I was losing her, like the person I thought I knew was slipping further away. I turned and started pacing the small kitchen, my mind racing with all the ways this could go wrong. Every part of me screamed that we had to leave, that there had to be some way out of this. But she was so sure, so determined to stay, I didn't know what to do anymore. "Why won't you fight back?" I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. "You can't just give up." She met my gaze, her eyes softening for a moment. "I'm not giving up," she said quietly. "I'm protecting you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For the briefest of moments, I saw the woman I used to know, before all the secrets, before the danger. She wasn't doing this out of fear. She was doing it because she thought it was the only way to keep me safe. But I couldn't accept that, not anymore. "Then let me help you," I said, stepping closer to her. "We can figure this out together. We don't have to just sit here, waiting for them to find us. There has to be another way." She shook her head, her gaze drifting back out the window. "You don't understand," she said softly. "There is no other way. They've been after me for years. They don't forget. They don't stop. No matter where we go, they'll find us. Then we fight," I said, my voice more determined now. "We don't just sit here and wait for them to win." For a long moment, she said nothing. The kitchen had grown dimmer as the last traces of sunlight faded, and the room felt colder. I watched her, waiting for some kind of response. When she finally spoke, her words froze me. "It's already too late," she whispered. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The way she said it, the way her voice trembled, sent a ripple of fear through me. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, her gaze was fixed on something far beyond, something I couldn't see. "I thought I could protect you," she murmured, her voice soft, almost resigned. "I thought I could keep you safe. But they're already here." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment I didn't fully understand. But then I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. My heart lurched in my chest as I whipped around toward the window. There, in the distance, I saw the headlights, slowly making their way up the dirt road toward the house. Panic surged through me. "We have to go," I said urgently, grabbing her arm. "We need to leave now." But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring out at the car approaching, her expression unreadable. "It's too late," she repeated, her voice eerily calm, almost serene. "There's nowhere left to run." I stared at her, disbelief flooding my mind. How could she be so calm? How could she just stand there, accepting whatever was coming? "Come on," I urged, my voice frantic. "We can still get out of here." But deep down I knew she was right. There was nowhere left to go. The car finally stopped at the end of the driveway, and I watched in horror as the doors slowly opened. Figures emerged from the vehicle, their faces hidden in the shadows. I didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. They had found us. The figures moved toward the house at a slow, deliberate pace, and my mind raced desperately to find a way out. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the window, but she didn't budge. It was as if she had already surrendered to what was coming. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "We need to go now." She didn't answer. Her body was stiff, as if frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the figures outside. I shook her arm harder, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. "Snap out of it," I hissed, my voice rising with panic. "We can still run. We can still—" "No," she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "There's no running anymore. It's over." I stared at her, stunned by the calmness in her voice. It felt like the world was spinning around me, and yet, she stood there, still unshaken. How could she be so calm? How could she just accept this? But then I saw it, the change in her eyes. It wasn't fear or even regret. It was something deeper, a quiet resignation. She had already made her decision. "What do you mean, it's over?" I demanded, my voice rising, panic clawing at my throat. "We can still fight. We don't have to give up." She faced me then, her expression softening when our eyes met. "I've been running from this for so long," she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I thought I could keep you safe, but I've dragged you into this mess. I'm so tired." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving a sharp ache where my heart used to be. I didn't know how to respond, or even what to feel. The woman in front of me wasn't the person I had known for years. She was someone else. Someone hiding a darkness so consuming that it had changed everything. I tried to swallow down the lump in my throat, my voice trembling. "We don't have to do this," I said, but it sounded more like a plea than a statement. "We can leave. We can run. We can go somewhere they'll never find us." But even as I spoke, the words lost their power. We couldn't outrun this. Whatever it was already closing in on us. And she knew it. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, sharper. The gravel beneath their boots crunched, their murmurs rising like an ominous storm. My body screamed at me to run, to flee, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't leave her. Not like this. She took a long, steadying breath, her shoulders slumping with the weight of everything she'd carried alone for so long. "I never wanted this for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I tried so hard to protect you, but all I've done is make things worse." My throat closed up at her words, and the world seemed to narrow to the two of us standing there, broken by the weight of what had been left unsaid. "You didn't have to do this alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You could have told me. I would have helped." Her lips twitched into a small, sad smile. "Some things you can't fix," she replied softly, a hint of resignation in her tone. "Some things are better left unknown." Her words settled between us, heavy and suffocating, and for a moment, I couldn't even begin to comprehend them. I wanted to argue, to tell her that we could still fight this, but the truth was, I didn't know what we were fighting or how. The front door creaked open, and the sound of footsteps inside snapped me back to reality. A cold panic gripped my chest as I turned, and the figures were already here. I heard them moving through the house, slow, methodical, like they knew we had no way out. She stepped in front of me, blocking my view. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her voice calm but firm. I wanted to argue, to say I didn't need protecting, but the words were stuck. My body was frozen in place, every muscle locked in terror. I could do nothing but watch, helpless, as the moment of reckoning approached. The first figure appeared in the doorway. His face was hidden in shadows, but his presence was all-consuming. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching us with unsettling calm. She didn't flinch. "You found us?" she said, her voice steady, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Now what?" The figure took a step forward, still concealed in darkness. "You know what happens next," he said, his voice cold and deliberate, as if he were speaking to someone he already knew. I felt the air shift, heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The inevitability of it all was closing in. And then, something happened that I didn't expect. She stepped forward. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice smooth, like she was trying to calm the storm around us. "But you leave him out of this." My heart stopped. What was she doing? Why was she offering herself like this? The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering her words. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice growing colder. Her eyes flicked to mine, and in that moment, I understood. She wasn't just surrendering. She was trying to shield me. She was choosing this fate so that I wouldn't have to. She was protecting me in the only way she thought she could. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm not letting you do this." She shook her head, her eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't begin to fathom. "It's the only way," she said softly. I wanted to scream, to shout that there had to be another way, that this wasn't the end. But the words never came. Instead, she turned to the figure standing tall, her decision made. And then, she kissed me. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't frantic. It was gentle, soft, like she was saying goodbye. When she pulled away, her eyes lingered on mine for a long moment, long enough to break me. And then she stepped forward, accepting whatever fate awaited her. The figure seized her arm, guiding her toward the door. And I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the love of my life was taken from me, unable to stop any of it. Just before they reached the threshold, she looked back. One last time, and then she was gone. The house fell silent. Too silent. The air felt frozen, still like the entire world had just stopped moving. I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, the weight of everything crashing down on me. My heart shattered into pieces, and I couldn't tell which was worse, the fact that she was gone, or the fact that I would never understand why she had to leave.